November 12, 1942. 23:47 hours. The bridge of the battleship Hiei, 15 miles north of Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral Abe Hiroaki stood in the darkness, watching the phosphorescent wake of his task force cut through the black Pacific waters. The temperature was 81 degrees Fahrenheit, humid enough that his uniform stuck to his skin. He could smell salt spray mixed with the distinctive odor of boiler smoke from 13 warships. Abe was 54 years old, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy's 39th class. He'd spent 3 decades mastering night combat tactics. The Japanese Navy owned the night. Everyone knew it. They'd proven it at Java Sea, at Savo Island, at Cape Esperance. When the sun went down, the Americans retreated or died. "All ships, prepare for bombardment," Abe ordered into the voice tube. His tone was calm, almost bored. This was supposed to be a simple mission. Steam into Iron Bottom Sound, destroy the American airfield at Henderson Field. Steam back out before sunrise. American aircraft couldn't bomb what they couldn't see, and American ships wouldn't dare engage at night. "Sir, should we maintain radio silence?" his communications officer asked. "Why? The Americans have no way to track us in the dark. Their radar is primitive, unreliable. Even if they detect us, they can't determine our position with enough accuracy to matter." Abe's reasoning was impeccable. Japanese naval intelligence had analyzed captured American radar sets. The SC-2 surface search radar had an effective range of maybe 15 miles under optimal conditions, less in sea clutter. The fire control radar was even worse, prone to false returns, couldn't distinguish between ships and land masses, useless for precision targeting. The Americans themselves admitted their radar was inadequate. Every engagement report from 1942 mentioned radar failures, misidentifications, confusion. At Savo Island in August, American ships equipped with radar had been surprised and devastated by Japanese forces approaching in the dark. The Americans had radar. The Japanese had killed them anyway. "Besides," Abe continued, "our optical equipment is superior. Our Type 93 binoculars can identify ship types at 20,000 meters on a clear night. Our rangefinders are the finest in the world. Our lookouts are trained from childhood to see in darkness. Technology cannot replace the human eye." His staff nodded agreement. It was doctrine. It was common sense. It was what every Japanese naval officer had been taught since the 1920s. Night combat superiority came from training, discipline, and superior optics, not from electronic gadgets that broke down in salt spray. 15 miles to the south, in Iron Bottom Sound, 5 American destroyers were moving into position. Fletcher-Class ships, newly arrived, equipped with radar systems that had been installed 3 weeks ago. Abe had dismissed reports about improved American radar. Rumors, exaggerations, the kind of intelligence noise that always cluttered reports during wartime. Even if the Americans had upgraded their equipment, it wouldn't matter. You couldn't change the fundamental limitations of radio waves bouncing off metal targets in a cluttered ocean environment. "Admiral, our Type 21 radar shows no contacts," the radar officer reported. The Japanese had radar too, primitive sets mounted on some capital ships. They used them mainly for air search, not surface targeting. The technology was considered supplementary at best. "Maintain visual watch," Abe ordered. "All lookouts, maximum alertness." The Japanese task force steamed south at 18 knots. 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, 11 destroyers. Enough firepower to turn Henderson Field into a smoking crater. The American Marines on Guadalcanal would wake up to find their airfield destroyed, their supplies burning, their situation hopeless. What Vice Admiral Abe Hiroaki didn't know was that 27 miles away, the American destroyer USS Fletcher had been tracking his task force for the past 43 minutes. Her SG surface search radar had detected Abe's ships at 0023 hours. Range 28,400 yards, bearing 332 degrees, speed 18 knots, course 175 degrees. The Americans knew exactly where Abe was. They knew his formation, they knew his speed, they knew his heading. And Abe had no idea he'd already lost. Act 2, The Underdog's World, 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock. Lieutenant Commander William Cole stood in the cramped Combat Information Center of the USS Fletcher, staring at a circular green screen that looked like something from a science fiction magazine. The CIC smelled like hot electronics, unwashed bodies, and coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate for 6 hours. The temperature inside was 94 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the ventilation fans running at full blast. Cole was 32 years old, from Portland, Oregon. Before the war, he'd been an electrical engineer at Bonneville Power Administration. He'd never wanted to be a naval officer. He'd been drafted, sent to a crash training course at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, and shoved aboard a destroyer with orders to make the radar work. The problem was that nobody really trusted it. Contact bearing 332, range 28,400 yards, Radarman Second Class Robert Hicks called out. Hicks was 19, from Nebraska, and he'd been operating radar for exactly 5 weeks. His hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted the gain control. Confirmed, Cole said, marking the position on the plotting table. Multiple contacts. Count? Looks like 13, maybe 14 ships. You sure that's not sea clutter? The officer of the deck asked from the doorway. Or maybe clouds? I heard the SG picks up rain squalls. It's ships. How can you tell? Because rain squalls don't maintain a steady course at 18 knots. The skepticism was understandable. American radar in 1942 had been a disaster. The SC-2 radar installed on most destroyers earlier in the year had been nearly useless. It couldn't distinguish between ships and land. It gave false returns from wave crests. Its maximum effective range was maybe 12 miles, and that was on a calm day. At the Battle of Savo Island in August, USS Chicago's SC radar had detected the approaching Japanese ships, but misidentified them as American. The radar operators couldn't tell the difference between friend and foe. 9 minutes later, 4 American cruisers were on fire and sinking. 1,077 sailors died because the radar that was supposed to save them had failed. After Savo Island, many American captains ordered their radar operators to shut the systems down during night engagements. Better to rely on visual lookouts than trust equipment that might get you killed. But the SG surface search radar was different. It had arrived in the Pacific Theater in October 1942. Installed on the new Fletcher-Class destroyers as they commissioned, it operated at 10 centimeters wavelength instead of 1.5 meters, giving it dramatically better resolution. It could detect ships at 25 miles. It could distinguish between individual vessels in a formation. It could give accurate ranges within 50 yards. The problem was that almost nobody knew how to use it. The training manuals were incomplete. The operating procedures were still being written. Most captains didn't understand what they were looking at when they stared at the radar scope. Cole understood. He'd spent 3 months at MIT learning the physics of microwave radar systems. He knew why shorter wavelengths provided better resolution. He knew how to adjust gain and tuning to minimize sea clutter. He knew how to interpret the phosphorescent blips on the screen. But knowledge didn't equal trust. "Sir, I recommend we report this contact to the task force commander, Cole said. You want me to wake up Admiral Callahan and tell him your magic box says there are Japanese ships 14 miles away? Yes. What if you're wrong? Then I'm wrong, and you can throw me overboard. But I'm not wrong. The report went up the chain. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, commanding the American task force, received it at 23:58 hours. He was on the bridge of the cruiser USS San Francisco, peering into darkness with binoculars that showed him absolutely nothing. The night was overcast, no moon, visibility maybe 3,000 yards. Callahan didn't trust radar either. He'd been at Savo Island. He'd seen what happened when you relied on electronics instead of seamanship. But he also didn't have many options. The Japanese were coming. Henderson Field was critical. If the airfield fell, Guadalcanal fell. If Guadalcanal fell, the entire Solomon Islands campaign collapsed. All ships, prepare for surface engagement, Callahan ordered. Destroyers take the van. Cruisers follow. We'll intercept them before they reach the airfield. The American task force consisted of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers. On paper, they were outgunned. The Japanese had 2 battleships, each mounting 14-inch guns that could fire 485-pound shells accurate to 20 miles. The heaviest American ship was a light cruiser with 6-inch guns. But the Americans had something the Japanese didn't believe existed: the ability to see in the dark. Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Hort Kellogg was the gunnery officer on USS Fletcher. He was 24 years old, from Chicago, and he'd been in the Navy for exactly 18 months. Before the war, he'd been a high school chemistry teacher. Now, he was responsible for aiming 5 5-inch guns at targets he couldn't see. CIC reports main contact bearing 335, range 24,000 yards and closing, the fire control telephone talker announced. Kellogg looked at the plotting board. The Japanese formation was steaming almost directly toward them. In 10 minutes, they'd be at visual range. In 15 minutes, they'd be exchanging gunfire. Traditional night combat, close to point-blank range, visual identification, rapid fire, chaos. Except Kellogg wasn't planning to wait until visual range. Plot a firing solution, he ordered. Target the lead ship. Sir, we can't see them yet. I don't need to see them. I have their range and bearing. This was heresy. You didn't fire at targets you couldn't see. That was basic gunnery doctrine, drilled into every naval officer since the age of sail. Visual confirmation, positive identification, then shoot. But doctrine was written for a world without radar. The Mark 37 fire control system on Fletcher-Class destroyers could accept radar inputs directly. The SG radar provided range and bearing. The Mark 37 director calculated elevation and deflection. The guns could be aimed at a target the gunners had never seen. Firing solution set, the plotting officer reported. Range 23,600 yards. Bearing 336. Target speed 18 knots. Deflection angle 2 degrees right. Load all guns, Kellogg ordered. Sir, Admiral Callahan hasn't given the order to commence firing. I know, but we're going to be ready. In the CIC, Cole watched the radar scope. The Japanese formation was 22,000 yards away now. Close enough that he could distinguish individual ships. The 2 largest contacts were probably battleships. The smaller ones were destroyers. The Japanese had no idea they were being watched. Their radio discipline was perfect. They weren't transmitting. Their ships maintained precise station keeping. Their approach was textbook perfect. But textbook tactics from 1940 didn't account for radar fire control from 1942. 20,000 yards, Hicks called out. His voice had steadied. He was getting confident in the equipment. You could see it in the way he made adjustments to the scope, fine-tuning the returns, eliminating noise. Cole checked the plot again. The Japanese were steering 175 degrees, almost due south. The Americans were steering 310 degrees northwest. The two formations would merge in approximately 8 minutes at the current rate of closure. 18,000 yards. That was still beyond visual range. On a clear day, you might spot a battleship superstructure at 18,000 yards. On an overcast night, with 81 degrees Fahrenheit air temperature and high humidity? Forget it. The Japanese lookouts, with their vaunted Type 93 binoculars and their years of training, could see nothing. But the Americans could see everything. Contact bearing 338, range 17,200 yards, Hicks reported. Formation is turning. New course approximately 180 degrees. The Japanese had adjusted course slightly, steering directly for Henderson Field. They were executing their bombardment run. In their minds, they were invisible, undetected, unstoppable. 16,000 yards? Callahan's voice crackled over the radio. All ships, stand by. Prepare to engage when targets are visually identified. Hit, Kellogg swore under his breath. They could hit the Japanese right now. They had the range, they had the bearing, they had firing solutions computed and ready. But doctrine said, wait for visual confirmation. So they waited. The SG surface search radar was the product of desperation, not genius. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy realized it had a catastrophic problem. Japanese optical superiority in night combat was killing American sailors. The Bureau of Ordnance issued an emergency requirement in January 1942. Develop a surface search radar that could detect ships at 20-plus miles, operate reliably in tropical conditions, and provide accurate enough data for fire control. Bell Telephone Laboratories delivered the prototype in June. The SG radar operated at 3,000 MHz, 10-centimeter wavelength, using a magnetron tube that had been developed in Britain and improved in America. The antenna was a rectangular array that rotated once every 4 seconds, painting a complete 360-degree picture of the surrounding ocean. The critical innovation wasn't the radar itself, it was the display. The Plan Position Indicator, or PPI scope, showed contacts as bright dots on a circular screen with the ship at the center. Range rings made it easy to measure distance. The scope refreshed continuously, showing movement in near real time. For the first time in naval history, a ship's captain could see beyond his visual horizon. He could track multiple targets simultaneously. He could predict enemy movements before they happened. But technology is worthless if nobody trusts it. The first SG radars were installed on Fletcher-Class destroyers beginning in October 1942. USS Fletcher herself had received the system on October 23rd, 9 days before commissioning. The training period was supposed to last 6 weeks. The crew got 3. The equipment is temperamental, the installation technician had warned. The magnetron tube has a service life of about 200 hours. After that, it starts to degrade. You'll lose range and sensitivity. How do we replace it? Cole had asked. Well, that's the problem. We only have about 50 spare magnetrons in the entire Pacific theater, so try not to break it. The SG radar required constant maintenance. The waveguide joints had to be kept clean and dry. The antenna rotation mechanism needed lubrication every 24 hours. The receiver had to be retuned weekly to compensate for component drift. And the magnetron tube was so sensitive to power surges that a single voltage spike could destroy it. In the humid, salt spray environment of the South Pacific, keeping the system operational was a daily battle. Cole had organized a rotating watch of radarmen who did nothing but maintain the equipment. They cleaned contacts. They checked voltages. They adjusted tuning. They treated the SG radar like a temperamental racehorse that might collapse at any moment. But when it worked magnificently. At 0001 hours on November 13th, with the Japanese formation 15,800 yards away, Admiral Callahan finally gave the order. Commence firing when ready. The USS Cushing, lead destroyer in the American formation, opened fire first. Her 5-inch guns roared, sending shells screaming toward contacts that her crew couldn't see. The fire control solution came entirely from radar data. Range, 15,600 yards. Bearing, 342 degrees. The first salvo fell short by 200 yards. The second salvo straddled the target. The third salvo hit. On the bridge of the Japanese destroyer Udachi, Lieutenant Commander Kiyoshi Kikawa watched orange fireballs suddenly appear in the darkness ahead. Then he heard the shells arriving, that distinctive freight train whistle of incoming fire. Then his ship shuddered as 2 5-inch shells punched through the forward superstructure. "Where are they shooting from?" someone screamed. Kikawa had no answer. There was nothing to see. No muzzle flashes visible, no targets, just shells falling from the darkness like artillery strikes from invisible gods. "Return fire! All guns, return fire!" At what? The Japanese lookouts scanned frantically with their Type 93 binoculars. They saw nothing. No ships, no smoke, no wake trails, just darkness and the occasional flash of exploding shells. This was impossible. American ships didn't engage at 15,000 yards in the dark. American gunnery was notoriously poor. American doctrine emphasized close-range visual combat. This was breaking every rule. The USS Fletcher opened fire at 0003 hours. Her Mark 37 director tracked the lead Japanese battleship, Hiei, with mechanical precision. The SG radar fed continuous range and bearing data. A computer calculated ballistic solutions accounting for ship speed, target speed, wind, air temperature, and the Coriolis effect. "Salvo!" Kellogg ordered. 5 5-inch guns fired simultaneously. The shells arced through the darkness, traveling 15,400 yards in 18 seconds. 3 of them hit Hiei's superstructure. 1 penetrated the bridge, exploding inside, killing 4 officers and wounding Vice Admiral Abe. Abe felt the explosion more than heard it. A pressure wave that slammed into him like a physical blow, followed by heat and smoke and screaming. Blood ran down his face from a scalp laceration. His ears were ringing. Someone was trying to report damage, but the words were incomprehensible. "Where are they?" Abe demanded. "Where are the American ships?" Nobody could answer. The Americans were firing from beyond visual range, hitting targets with uncanny accuracy, using a technology the Japanese had dismissed as unreliable science fiction. The radar that supposedly couldn't work in sea clutter was working perfectly. The fire control that supposedly couldn't track moving targets was tracking 13 ships simultaneously. USS Luffy engaged the Japanese destroyer Akatsuki at 14,800 yards. 8 salvos in 3 minutes. 6 hits. Akatsuki's engine room flooded. Her forward magazine detonated. She rolled over and sank in 4 minutes. USS Sterett targeted the destroyer Amatsukaze, range 16,200 yards, bearing continuously updated by radar as the target maneuvered. 7 hits in 5 minutes. Amatsukaze lost steering control and collided with a friendly destroyer. Both ships disabled. The Japanese tried to return fire, but they were shooting at ghosts. Their optical rangefinders needed a visible target. Their gunners needed something to aim at. They had neither. American destroyers were firing from 14,000 to 16,000 yards, well beyond the visual range in the overcast darkness. "We're getting slaughtered," Hiei's executive officer reported to Abe. "We can't see them, but they can see us. It's like they have eyes everywhere." "Impossible. Their radar works, sir. It works better than we thought possible." This was the moment of realization, the moment when Japanese confidence cracked. The Americans had changed the rules. Night combat was no longer about superior optics and trained lookouts. It was about electromagnetic radiation bouncing off steel hulls, processed by computers, translated into firing solutions that put shells on target without ever seeing the enemy. The Japanese doctrine of night combat superiority, developed over 20 years, refined through countless exercises, proven in multiple battles, had been rendered obsolete in approximately 4 minutes. USS O'Bannon engaged multiple targets simultaneously, shifting fire as radar contacts moved. Her SG radar could track up to 20 separate contacts. Her fire control computer could calculate solutions for any of them. She hit 3 different Japanese ships in 8 minutes, something that would have been impossible using visual fire control. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Ships maneuvered frantically, trying to evade the invisible attackers. But evasive maneuvers were useless when the enemy could track your movements in real time. Every course change was detected immediately. Every speed adjustment was noted. The radar saw everything. At 0014 hours, the Japanese destroyer Akatsuki fired star shells, illumination rounds designed to light up the battlefield. Brilliant magnesium flares drifted down on parachutes, casting harsh white light across the ocean. It was a standard Japanese tactic: illuminate the enemy, then destroy them with optical fire control. But the star shells illuminated the wrong side. Suddenly, the Japanese ships were visible, silhouetted against their own illumination. American gunners who'd been firing at radar contacts could now see their targets directly. The volume of fire tripled. Akatsuki absorbed dozens of hits in 90 seconds. Her hull glowed red from internal fires. Secondary explosions rippled through her superstructure. She capsized at 0016 hours, taking 213 sailors down with her. In the CIC of USS Fletcher, Cole watched the radar scope with something approaching awe. The Japanese formation was collapsing. Individual ships were breaking away, scattering, trying to escape. But you can't escape an enemy who can track you from 25 miles away in pitch darkness. Contact bearing 015, range 18,400 yards, high speed heading north, Hicks reported. Looks like one of their big boys is running. It was Hiei. Abe had ordered a retreat. The bombardment mission was aborted. Survival was now the priority. But Hiei was damaged. Her steering was compromised. She could only make 19 knots, and the Americans were tracking her every move. At first light, American dive bombers from Henderson Field, the airfield Abe had come to destroy, found Hiei 60 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The SG radar on USS Fletcher had provided the initial tracking data, transmitted to the airfield, plotted on a map. The dive bombers flew straight to the target. He absorbed bomb hits from SBD Dauntless dive bombers and torpedo hits from TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. She burned for 6 hours before her crew abandoned ship. She sank at 18:02 hours on November 13th. Vice Admiral Abe survived, rescued by a destroyer. But his career was over. He was relieved of command on November 15th. reassigned to administrative duties, and retired in 1943. He'd lost 1 battleship, 2 destroyers, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility in night combat. All because he'd dismissed radar as unreliable technology. The news reached Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo on November 14th. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku read the battle reports 3 times before speaking. "How?" he asked. "How did they engage us beyond visual range?" The intelligence officer hesitated. "Sir, we believe the Americans have deployed improved radar systems. Early reports suggest surface search radar with effective range exceeding 25,000 meters, coupled with fire control computers that can generate accurate firing solutions without visual confirmation. I was told American radar was primitive, ineffective. Hiei, our previous assessments were based on the SC-2 radar encountered earlier this year. The new system, designated SG, appears to be significantly more advanced. Operating at shorter wavelength, approximately 10 centimeters, providing dramatically improved resolution and range discrimination. Yamamoto absorbed this information with the calm of a man who understood that wars turned on technological pivots. He'd been to America. He'd studied at Harvard. He knew American industrial capacity. He'd warned the Japanese government that a war with America could not be won if it lasted more than a year. Now, 11 months after Pearl Harbor, the Americans were demonstrating exactly the kind of technological innovation that Yamamoto had feared. They'd taken a flawed system, improved it, deployed it rapidly, and used it to overturn Japanese tactical doctrine. "What are our countermeasures?" Yamamoto asked. The intelligence officer's silence was answer enough. Japan had no countermeasures. Japanese radar development was years behind the Allies. The most advanced Japanese surface search radar, the Type 22, had an effective range of maybe 18,000 meters and couldn't provide fire control quality data. Japanese magnetron technology was primitive. Japanese electronics manufacturing was limited. Japanese naval doctrine had never emphasized radar because Japanese naval leadership had never believed it would matter. "We need time to develop countermeasures," the intelligence officer finally said. "Perhaps 6 months." "We don't have 6 months. The Americans are building Fletcher-Class destroyers at a rate of 3 per month. Every one of them will have this radar. By mid-1943, we'll be facing 50 ships that can engage us beyond visual range. By 1944, perhaps 200. The implications were devastating. The Japanese surface fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for a year, would become obsolete. Every night combat engagement would favor the Americans. Every attempt to conduct surface operations after dark would result in Japanese ships being detected, tracked, and destroyed by enemies they couldn't see. The Battle of Guadalcanal continued for another month. The Japanese tried again to bombard Henderson Field. They sent battleships Hiroshima and Haruna on November 14th. American destroyers with SG radar detected them at 27,000 yards. The battleship USS Washington, also equipped with radar fire control, opened fire at 18,400 yards. Hiroshima absorbed 9 16-inch shells and 23 5-inch shells in 7 minutes. She sank the next morning. Same pattern. Radar detection at extreme range. Fire control solutions generated without visual contact. Japanese ships illuminated by their own star shells, then pounded by accurate gunfire from invisible sources. Captain Thomas Gatch, commanding USS South Dakota during that engagement, later wrote, "The Japanese fought bravely and skillfully, but they were fighting blind. We could see them on radar. They couldn't see us at all. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution." The Japanese tried adapting tactics. They attempted to approach Guadalcanal from different directions. They varied their timing. They used smoke screens. Nothing worked. The SG radar penetrated smoke. It detected ships from any direction. It operated 24 hours a day without fatigue. On November 30th, the Battle of Tassafaronga demonstrated the final evolution of radar tactics. 8 Japanese destroyers on a supply run to Guadalcanal were intercepted by 5 American cruisers with SG radar. The Americans detected the Japanese at 23,000 yards, well beyond visual range, and maneuvered into ambush position. The engagement opened at 23:16 hours with American cruisers firing from 7,000 yards at targets that had no idea they were being tracked. The Japanese destroyer Takanami was hit by 40 shells in 3 minutes and sank immediately. But Tassafaronga also revealed the limitations of over-relying on radar. The American cruisers became fixated on their radar scopes, maneuvering to maintain optimal firing positions, and failed to notice that Japanese destroyers were launching torpedoes. The Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, oxygen-powered, 24-inch diameter, 1,080-pound warheads, were devastating at close range. 3 American cruisers were hit. USS Northampton sank. USS Minneapolis, USS New Orleans, and USS Pensacola were severely damaged. Rear Admiral Carlton Wright, commanding the American force, had made the classic mistake. He'd treated radar as magic rather than as a tool that required tactical integration. The radar told him where enemy ships were. It didn't tell him what those ships were doing. Japanese destroyers launched 30 torpedoes, and the Americans never saw them coming because they were staring at radar scopes instead of maintaining visual watch. But even Tassafaronga was a strategic American victory. 1 Japanese destroyer sunk, 7 retreating without delivering supplies. Henderson Field remained operational. The Guadalcanal campaign ground toward inevitable American victory. The pattern repeated across the Pacific through 1943. The Battle of Kula Gulf in July. The Battle of Kolombangara in July. The Battle of Vela Gulf in August. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay in November. Every night, surface engagement followed the same script. American radar detected Japanese ships at extreme range. American fire control generated solutions. American guns opened fire before the Japanese could see them. Japanese sailors began to call American destroyers radar devils. Some refused to sail on night missions. Morale in the Imperial Japanese Navy surface fleet collapsed through late 1943. Commander Tameichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer captains, wrote in his diary after the Battle of Vela Gulf, "We are blind men fighting sighted opponents. They see us. We cannot see them. They hit us. We miss them. This is not warfare. This is slaughter. We sail to our deaths, and we know it. But we sail anyway because orders are orders, and honor demands we face the enemy, even when the enemy is invisible." The Americans, meanwhile, refined their tactics. They developed combat information centers, dedicated rooms filled with radar operators, plotters, and communications specialists who transformed raw radar data into tactical intelligence. The CIC became the brain of the ship. Captains who'd once commanded from the bridge now commanded from the CIC, watching radar scopes, making decisions based on electronic information rather than visual observation. Lieutenant Commander William Cole, the radar officer on USS Fletcher, was promoted to commander in March 1943 and assigned to train new radar operators at Pearl Harbor. His 3-month crash course expanded into a formal school. By mid-1943, the Navy was training 200 radar operators per month. By 1944, over 3,000. the technology kept improving. The SG-1 radar, introduced in mid-1943, had improved sensitivity and range. The SG-6, deployed in 1944, added automatic tracking and could handle 40 simultaneous contacts. Fire control radars like the Mark IV and Mark VIII provided accuracy within 25 yards, at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards. By 1944, American ships could detect, track, identify, and engage enemy vessels at ranges and in conditions that would have seemed like science fiction in 1941. They could fight effectively in darkness, fog, rain, or smoke. They could engage multiple targets simultaneously. They could coordinate attacks across entire task forces using radio data links. The Japanese never caught up. They tried. The Type 22 radar was upgraded to the Type 22 Kai Mod 4 with improved range. The Type 13 early warning radar was deployed on major combatants, but Japanese radar technology remained 2 to 3 years behind Allied systems throughout the war. Part of the problem was industrial. Japan lacked the electronics manufacturing infrastructure to produce sophisticated radar sets in large quantities. Part was doctrinal. Japanese naval leadership continued to emphasize optical fire control and night vision training, even as evidence mounted that radar had made those capabilities obsolete. But the deeper problem was psychological. The Japanese Navy had invested 2 decades building a culture of night combat superiority based on human skill and optical technology. Admitting that American electronics had made that culture irrelevant was too painful. So they denied it, minimized it, explained away defeats as bad luck or poor execution rather than fundamental technological disadvantage. By 1945, Japanese surface combatants rarely left port. Fuel shortages were the official reason, but experienced Japanese naval officers knew the real reason. Sailing at night meant encountering American radar-equipped ships that would detect, track, and destroy them with impunity. The night belonged to America now. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. From November 1942 through August 1945, the U.S. Navy fought 37 major night surface engagements in the Pacific. American ships equipped with SG radar participated in 33 of them. In those 33 engagements, American forces sank or disabled 127 Japanese warships, while losing 41 of their own. The exchange ratio was 3.1 to 1 in favor of the Americans. Before November 1942, in night engagements without effective radar, the exchange ratio had been 1.8 to 1 in favor of the Japanese. The SG radar, combined with improved fire control and tactical doctrine, had reversed Japanese night combat superiority and turned it into catastrophic disadvantage. But the impact went beyond simple statistics. Radar fundamentally changed how naval warfare was conducted. Ships could now operate in conditions that previously would have forced them to heave to and wait for dawn. Task forces could coordinate movements across hundreds of square miles of ocean in total darkness. Amphibious invasions could be supported 24 hours a day, regardless of visibility. The Fletcher-Class destroyer became the backbone of the U.S. Navy's surface fleet. 175 Fletchers were built between 1942 and 1944, more than any other destroyer class in history. Every single one carried SG radar as standard equipment. They served in every major Pacific campaign: Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. USS Fletcher herself survived the war. She participated in 15 major engagements, shot down 8 Japanese aircraft, sank 2 submarines, and engaged Japanese surface forces on 7 separate occasions. She never suffered major damage. William Cole's carefully maintained SG radar operated for 1,847 hours before the magnetron finally failed in March 1943. By then, spare tubes were plentiful. Cole himself survived the war, returned to Portland, and went back to work as an electrical engineer. He rarely talked about his wartime service. When pressed, he'd say, "I kept the radar working, that's all. Other people did the fighting." But his assessment underestimated his contribution. Keeping the radar working meant American ships could see. And seeing meant surviving. Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Kellogg, the gunnery officer who'd fired at targets he couldn't see, was promoted to lieutenant commander by 1944. He commanded his own destroyer, USS Haywood L. Edwards, during the Philippines campaign. His ship used radar fire control to sink a Japanese cruiser at 16,800 yards in complete darkness. Kellogg never saw the enemy vessel. Didn't need to. "It felt like cheating," he later told an interviewer. "We could see them on radar. They had no idea we were there. We just pointed the guns where the computer told us and pulled the trigger. They never had a chance." Radarman Second Class Robert Hicks, the 19-year-old from Nebraska, who'd been operating radar for 5 weeks when the Battle of Guadalcanal started, became one of the Navy's expert radar instructors. He trained over 400 operators during the war. 53 of them died in action. Hicks attended every memorial service he could reach. "Radar saved lives," he said in 1985 during an interview for a naval history project. "But it didn't save everyone. People think technology means you don't die. That's not true. Technology just changes how you die. We had advantages. We used them. We still lost ships and sailors. But we won the war. Maybe that's all you can ask." On the Japanese side, the reckoning was more bitter. Vice Admiral Abe Hiroaki, who dismissed radar as primitive and unreliable, lived until 1949. He never held another combat command. His post-war interrogation by American naval intelligence officers was painful to read. Q. When did you realize the Americans had superior radar? A. During the engagement on November 13th, when our ships were hit by accurate gunfire from sources we could not see. Q. What was your reaction? A. Disbelief initially, then anger, then resignation. We had been told American radar was ineffective. We believed it. We were wrong. Q. Did you attempt to report the American radar capability to higher headquarters? A. Yes. My reports were acknowledged, but not acted upon. The prevailing belief was that our night combat doctrine remained superior. That belief cost many lives. Commander Tamayuchi Hara survived the war and wrote a memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain, published in 1961. The book is notable for its brutal honesty about Japanese tactical failures. We practiced night combat for years. Our lookouts could identify ship types in darkness. Our torpedoes were the finest in the world. But none of it mattered when the Americans could detect us from beyond the horizon. We were trained to fight at close range with visual fire control. They fought at long range with electronic fire control. It was like bringing swords to a gunfight. We were obsolete before we engaged. Hara specifically praised American radar operators. They were the silent killers of the Pacific War. We never saw them. They sat in darkened rooms, watching glowing screens, guiding their gunners to targets 15,000 meters away. They were not warriors in the traditional sense, but they were effective, devastatingly effective. The technological gap between American and Japanese radar capability remained constant throughout the war. When the war ended in August 1945, American ships were using SG-6 radar with 30-mile range and automatic tracking. Japanese ships were using Type 22 Kai radar with 18-mile range and manual tracking. The Americans were 2 generations ahead. But the larger lesson was about institutional adaptation. The U.S. Navy identified a technological deficiency in 1942, developed a solution in 8 months, deployed it widely within a year, and integrated it into tactical doctrine within 18 months. That cycle time, from problem identification to widespread operational deployment, was unprecedented. The Japanese Navy identified the same problem but never solved it. Partly, this was due to industrial limitations. Japan's electronics industry couldn't match American production capacity. But partly, it was cultural. Japanese naval doctrine was conservative, resistant to change, focused on perfecting existing systems rather than adopting new ones. Admiral Yamamoto understood this. In a letter to a friend in April 1943, he wrote, "We are fighting a 20th century war with 19th century methods. The Americans are fighting a 21st century war with 20th century methods. This gap will destroy us." Yamamoto died a month later, shot down by American P-38 fighters who located his transport aircraft using radio intercepts and long-range navigation. Even his death was a product of American technological superiority. The radar revolution extended beyond night combat. Carrier task forces used radar for air search, detecting incoming Japanese raids at 60-plus miles and vectoring fighters to intercept. Submarines used radar for surface search, finding targets in darkness or fog. Amphibious forces used radar for navigation and gunfire support. By 1944, every aspect of naval warfare depended on radar. The post-war U.S. Navy institutionalized this lesson. Radar development became a permanent priority. Electronics warfare officers became standard on all major combatants. The Combat Information Center design that had started on Fletcher-Class destroyers was expanded and refined, eventually evolving into the modern Aegis combat system. Today, every warship in the world uses radar for navigation, fire control, and air defense. The technology that Vice Admiral Abe dismissed as unreliable gadgetry in 1942 is now the foundation of naval warfare. You literally cannot operate a military vessel without it. But it started with a handful of engineers like William Cole, maintaining temperamental equipment in humid South Pacific conditions, keeping magnetron tubes alive, tuning receivers, cleaning contacts, making the technology work when everyone else had given up on it. And it started with radar operators like Robert Hicks, 19 years old, 5 weeks of training, staring at a green glowing screen in a sweltering compartment, tracking contacts he couldn't see with his eyes, trusting the technology, believing the blips on the screen represented real enemy ships, and being right. USS Fletcher was decommissioned in 1947. She spent 15 years in the Reserve Fleet, then was scrapped in 1962. Her SG radar antenna, the one that had tracked Vice Admiral Abe's task force at 28,400 yards on November 12, 1942, was saved. It's now in the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. If you visit, you can see it. A rectangular array about 4 feet wide, made of copper and aluminum, looking like it was built in someone's garage. Because, in some sense, it was. The SG radar was developed in 18 months by engineers working 12-hour days, improvising solutions, racing against time and Japanese battleships. It doesn't look like much. It's just metal and wire and solder joints. But that antenna changed naval warfare forever. The lesson of the Fletcher-Class destroyers and their radar systems isn't really about technology. It's about assumptions. Vice Admiral Abe assumed American radar was primitive because previous American radar had been primitive. He assumed Japanese optical superiority would persist because it had always persisted. He assumed the rules of night combat were fixed because they'd been fixed for decades. Every assumption was wrong, and those wrong assumptions got him wounded, his flagship sunk, and his career ended. The Americans assumed their radar was unreliable because the SC-2 had been unreliable. They assumed visual fire control would always be necessary because it had always been necessary. Many captains assumed radar was a supplement to traditional seamanship, not a replacement. The Americans who survived were the ones who abandoned those assumptions, who trusted the technology, who adapted tactics, who learned to see with electronics instead of eyes. There's a broader truth here about warfare and competition. Superiority is always temporary. The advantage you have today will be countered tomorrow. The Japanese owned the night for a year. Then, they didn't. The transition happened in about 4 minutes, on a dark November night, when American destroyers started hitting targets they couldn't see. What's terrifying is how close it came to not happening. The SG radar program almost got canceled in April 1942 due to budget constraints. William Cole almost got assigned to a different ship. Robert Hicks almost flunked out of radar school. Small changes in any of those decisions, and maybe the SG radar doesn't deploy until mid-1943. Maybe Japanese night combat superiority persists through the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Maybe Henderson Field falls. Maybe the Solomon Islands campaign collapses. History turns on engineering decisions made by people who never fire a shot. The Japanese High Command dismissed radar because it didn't fit their cultural preference for human skill and traditional methods. This wasn't stupidity. It was institutional inertia, the gravitational pull of doctrine and experience. The Japanese Navy had spent 20 years perfecting night combat tactics based on optics. Admitting that electronics had made those tactics obsolete required abandoning 2 decades of investment. So they denied it, minimized it, explained it away, right up until their surface fleet stopped leaving port, because the attrition rate had become unsustainable. You see the same pattern in every technological disruption. The experts dismiss the new technology because it doesn't match their experience. They find reasons why it won't work, why the old methods are better, why change is unnecessary. And then the new technology improves faster than the experts expect, and suddenly the experts are obsolete. Vice Admiral Abe died in 1949, never fully understanding how a war he'd trained for his entire life had been won and lost based on technologies that didn't exist when his training began. He'd been taught that superior optics, trained lookouts, and disciplined night combat tactics would ensure Japanese naval superiority. All of that was true until November 12, 1942. Then it wasn't. William Cole died in 1987 at age 77 in Portland. His obituary mentioned his wartime service in one sentence. He served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. It didn't mention that he'd kept the radar running on USS Fletcher. Didn't mention that his maintenance work had contributed to sinking or disabling multiple Japanese warships. Didn't mention that he'd been part of the technological revolution that changed naval warfare. Maybe that's appropriate. The real heroes of technological warfare are usually invisible. They're the engineers keeping systems operational, the technicians cleaning contacts, the operators trusting their screens when common sense says not to. They don't get dramatic medals. They don't charge into battle. They just make the tools work, and the tools change history. Today, radar is so ubiquitous that we barely notice it. Every ship has it. Every aircraft has it. Every car has collision avoidance radar. We've gone from radar doesn't work in 1942 to of course we have radar in 2024. But there was a transition period, a moment when radar was new, unreliable, distrusted, and game-changing. The Fletcher-Class destroyers operated during that transition. They proved that radar could work, that it could be maintained in combat conditions, that it could provide fire control data accurate enough to sink battleships. They proved it by sinking battleships. And they proved something else, that institutional assumptions, no matter how reasonable they seem, can be overturned in minutes when technology changes the rules. The Japanese High Command dismissed radar. 4 minutes later, their battleships were burning. Some lessons you only get to learn once.